However, the economic interest of the donor is not necessarily aligned with urgent development needs of the recipient and could make it difficult to manage for results. Often, countries explicitly pursuing self-interest cannot meet international standards of development assistance and therefore will eventually distance themselves from the rest of the development community. Considering that harmonization and partnership among development players is considered essential to producing concrete results, Korea has to implement development aid based on internationally agreed terms and practices. Only when we view aid as a long-term investment for the sake of our partners, not as something that produces immediate results for ourselves, Korea can truly build its brand as a country that not only turned itself into an industrialized nation, but also helped others to transform into prosperous economies. Well, up to now, I have offered a fairly unsystematic overview of Korea's potential role in the field of development cooperation with reference to the country's reputation. ODA is an indispensable part of advancing the country's reputation in international community and ultimately becoming a global leader, as well as helping prevent global disasters, which are the duty for all members of the international community. By enhancing the scale and quality of its ODA, together with the involvement of the Korean private sector's corporate social responsibility, I think Korea's international reputation will be advanced as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Chang, for giving us a very good picture of how we are doing in development cooperation, which should have great bearings on nation branding. Professor Carr?
Could I have the clicker, please? And could you... Thank you. Thank you. Well, Minister Oh, thank you very much for this session. I've been asked to speak on the subject of public diplomacy. What should Korea do? And what I think that means is trying to take the present Korean strategy for engaging the world and mapping it onto the concepts of public diplomacy, seeing where nation branding and public diplomacy intersect. And in my presentation, I'll start by talking a little bit about Korea's dilemma and the problem that you face. And then I want to set out two frameworks of public diplomacy, what I call classical public diplomacy, and then looking at the new public diplomacy and the way in which the tools of public diplomacy have changed in recent years. And then I'll finish up with a section on where next for Korea. But first of all, Korea's dilemma. We think of Korea today as facing a contradiction. You have a successful economy, an emerging brand, and yet it has a mixed performance in the indexes of such things. Doing well by some yardsticks, a leader online, more broadband connections in Korea than anywhere else, wonderful export figures, and yet there are negatives too. We've already talked about the underperformance in relative to economic scale in Simon's index, but there are numerous other problems too, and social problems in Korea. Korea leads the world in suicides, in alcoholism, and in soon to lead the world, I'm told, in divorce. Whether these are related, I don't know. Not really matters for branding. there's this question of the Korea discount. When a product comes from Korea, you can't ask the same price for it that you can ask if exactly the same product comes from Japan, because the national reputation means that it isn't the same. The customer who buys a Korean product is buying something different. And this leads to the Korean gap, the gap between what Korea does and how Korea is perceived. So into this problem, we have the tools of public diplomacy. And before I go any further, I feel I owe you a definition of public diplomacy. Traditional diplomacy, I think, is an actor, an international actor, so it could be a nation state, could be an international organization, or any other actor at the international level, but an international actor attempting to manage the international environment through engagement with a foreign actor. And summits are a typical venue for this sort of actor-to-actor diplomacy. Public diplomacy is something different. It is an actor's attempt to manage the international environment still, yes, an actor's attempt to conduct foreign policy still, but it's using a different set of tools, the tools of engagement with a foreign public. So it's actor-to-public diplomacy. And an example would be international broadcasting. Korea has been a recipient over the years of international broadcasts. You remember back in Voice of America and so forth. And today, you have BBC World Service and so forth. But even though we have this term public diplomacy, which is a reasonably modern term, coined in 1965, I would argue that it's actually a term which covers 5 old practices which are pretty much as old as statecraft. And the fundamental practice of public diplomacy, the fundamental way in which an international actor engages with a foreign public, should be to listen to that public. When Sun Tzu was writing about warfare more than 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, he said, know your enemy. He's talking about listening. He's talking about studying, paying attention to the public you wish to engage with overseas. And today, there are many forms of listening, but research, the sort of research that's done by the branding indexes and other forms of international research, is one way of listening to foreign publics. But I think it's important, a component of public diplomacy, to actually pay attention to the people you wish to communicate to first, before you communicate to them. You'd think that would be obvious, but there are nation states in the world who do not listen and just look at public diplomacy as talking. The second element of public diplomacy is advocacy. We can look in the writings of the Greek historian Herodotus and find examples of advocacy even then, of leaders sending out people to explain their policies to publics as part of their international strategies. Today we do this through leaders' speeches, through press conferences, and so forth. And foreign ministries, I think, are really on top of this business of international advocacy. Cultural diplomacy has been significant across the centuries. Rulers have sought to diffuse, to increase their power by diffusing their culture. The illustration here is of a saint, Saint Cyril, who was paid by the Byzantine Church. Who was paid by the Byzantine Emperor to spread Orthodox Christianity across what is now Eastern Europe. And that act of the Byzantine Emperor to underwrite the spread of a particular religious, a particular kind of Christianity, has resulted in resulted in greater cultural influence for Byzantium, and that influence is still felt today. There's still consequences of that act of cultural diplomacy. So we're talking about something that can last for a long time. And today, I think the work of the Korea Foundation is an excellent way of reaching out, facilitating the export of Korean culture. But cultural diplomacy tends to be one way, tends to be a country showing its culture to others. We have the fourth element, exchange diplomacy. This also goes back into the past, where ancient tribes would exchange children between one village and another, raise each other's children as a way of building kinship bonds. And this happened all around the world. In Europe, this process was called, Northern Europe, it was called foster, and we still use the term foster child for this process. The successor to this process are the international exchanges, and Korea has done a lot to foster international exchange, sending Koreans overseas, bringing foreigners to this country. The final element is international broadcasting. This is something that I think Britain has been particularly good at, and it's something that Korea is starting to enter into. Yesterday, I think, was the 10th anniversary of Arirang TV's international satellite broadcast, both news and feature and documentary programming. This is not currently closely connected to the Korean nation branding strategy. The station is run by a foundation, and maybe one of the things we could see within improving a Korean nation branding strategy would be closer cooperation with an international broadcaster, and through that cooperation improving the quality of what Arirang does, which is already far superior to CCTV9, the Chinese English language broadcaster. Arirang is now available, it's been available in Los Angeles for a couple of months now, and has just become available in New York City. So it's starting to be really, I think, we have an emerging voice for Korea internationally. Now, there are these 5 forms of communication that are as old as statecraft, pretty much. The United States came along and created a single term, public diplomacy. But just because there's a single term doesn't mean that you have to put it all under one ministry, have one person telling you what to do, and have a very rigid control. I would say quite the reverse. Public diplomacy was coined as a term to fit the needs of 1965. You had President Lyndon Johnson, as here in this cartoon, troubled by the scar of Vietnam, needing to communicate to the world and wanting to be able to say, I'm an American, I do public diplomacy, those wicked communists, they do propaganda. He wanted to be able to differentiate between communist and democratic international communication. Just because we have one word doesn't mean we have to have one structure. And I think it's better than thinking of public diplomacy as being a single sort of a pyramid. Think of it as an umbrella term under which each of these elements can function, and functions best if they have a certain level of independence. This is how the Canadians conceive of their public diplomacy pyramid. You've got this. I won't go into this diagram now. It's quite. You have it in your handouts. But public diplomacy is changing. We now have a new context for public diplomacy, and scholars now talk about the new public diplomacy. I'll talk about the features of this new public diplomacy as I bring things to a conclusion. And the first is public diplomacy is happening in a new context. Originally, this new context was a disproportionate power of the United States, and now we have a United States in crisis being challenged by other powers. And I think that this creates opportunities for voices like the Korean voice in the world. We have, in the new public diplomacy, new technologies. And Korea has a remarkable place in this world of new technologies as a creator of hardware and also as a creator of software. Korean online games are becoming familiar around the world, like the game illustrated here, Legacies. But at the moment, online gaming tends to just connect people to their own population. International publics are not meeting each other that often in online games. one way in which publics do meet is in virtual worlds, like the world of Second Life. And the Swedes have quite innovatively opened an embassy space in Second Life where people or their avatars can meet and can talk, find out more about Sweden. It's not that complicated to do, and it would just be a way of leveraging the Korean identity in this space. And we have the emergence of social media, Twitter being one form. And maybe we could talk, if we have time for discussion, about ways in which Korea could use social media more effectively to communicate to the people around the world who actually want to hear from Korea. Because with these media, you subscribe to regular messages. There's a new transparency in the new public diplomacy. A word spoken in your home country will quite often be heard around the world, and a word spoken overseas can be heard in the home country. Now, I think that this is a problem, especially for the great powers, for the United States, for China, for Russia, because this transparency means that their public diplomacy is increasingly being conducted for domestic political consumption. And Korea must guard against this, but has an opportunity again to come forward with genuine international engagement. There's a new role for people in the new public diplomacy. We know from polls, when you ask people who is the most authoritative person on any subject, they now tend not to say, oh, this particular professional, this doctor, this politician, or that journalist. They say, someone like me. Now, when you divide up the world into sort of national groups, someone like me, that makes it hard for public diplomacy. The trick is to show how someone like me might be somebody in Korea who can then become an authoritative voice on a particular subject. So finding ways of connecting Koreans through new technology to people like them in other countries is an important way of doing it. And this could be professional to professional connection. I've been very struck, speaking to people in the American Armed Forces, of the intense regard of the American Armed Forces for their peers in Korea, especially Korean special forces, very respected by American special forces. Korea has a special, one of the things that marks Korea out from other countries in Asia is the presence of Christianity here. And I think that peer-to-peer church connection would be a very powerful way of bringing Korea person to person, connecting Korean people to people in the rest of the world. Diaspora diplomacy is another feature of the new public diplomacy. There are Korean citizens all around the world, and these people can be a voice for Korea, can be a way of engaging, bringing Korea alive for people in those countries. But equally, there are foreigners in Korea. And international communication is not just about what the government says about a country. It's what foreign visitors in your country report to their friends back home. So if foreign workers coming to Korea are having a bad time or having experiences that run against your preferred brand for Korea, that will damage your international reputation. And I'm very glad that multiculturalism has been moved to the fore in the strategy set out by the President's Commission. There's a new resource, soft power, and I think Korea has the potential for a lot of soft power, attractive values, and it has statesmen like Kim Dae-jung who have, I think, have power to appeal as people of virtue to the rest of the world. And Kim Dae-jung's sunshine policy was something that really did a lot to help the international image of Korea. Today, Ban Ki-moon, as UN Secretary General, is an asset to Korea and an exemplar of what Korea can do as a global citizen. To wrap up, Korea's public diplomacy cannot change the international reputation of Korea instantly. I can see that the reputation is moving, but you must be prepared for it to take time. The underlying trends, I think, are good. You can see Korea moving in world opinion as it becomes better known, as it does more. As you work, I think you have a need to preserve the firewalls between the different elements of your public diplomacy. It would be a negative for the Korea Foundation to be seen as too politicized, and the Korea Foundation should be insulated from the foreign ministry to function properly. You need a budget. Money, resources have to go to public diplomacy. This is the comparative budget for cultural diplomacy in absolute terms, in millions of dollars. And you can see Korea is right down there at the bottom. You might, between these sort of prominent players in cultural diplomacy. The UK is spending a lot on cultural diplomacy, in part because the British Council is able to market its English language teaching and testing services. If it didn't have that earned income, there'd be much more parity. But when we go to an adjusted by population, you see how the United States is spending a lot less. But Korea isn't spending more relative to its population size. There's a need for a much bigger budget, I think. For Korea to be competitive as a cultural diplomacy player, it needs to be spending more on the Korea Foundation, probably at least twice as much to begin with. But what's the point of public diplomacy without good policy? It all rests on good policy, and I feel good policy becomes a good story, and the best story would be Korea's performance as a middle power, engaging as a good citizen in the world and doing the right things for the right reasons. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Carr, for that excellent presentation, especially with all those eye-catching illustrations. Professor Choi Jang-hwa.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank Ambassador Im Sung-jun for giving me this opportunity to talk about how to promote Korea's national brand. This is a mind map of my presentation. As you can see, Korea is not very well known to the world. So I'd like to talk about how to promote Korea's national brand by improving fundamentals and by using effective delivery methods. As a lot of presenters already said, brand is essential not only for companies, but also nations. So Korea must advertise and let people know its competitiveness to the world, just like companies. Let's take the example of France, because my husband is French. Why does everybody want to visit France? As you all know, because of its familiarity and because of the attraction of the country itself. Philip Raskin, who is the representative director of Burson Marsteller Korea, said, "Paris doesn't need a slogan. It's just Paris. Paris would be attractive even if its slogan was 'Go to hell.'" To set up strategies to promote the national brand, CC, Korea Image Communication Institute, which I'm heading, conducted a lot of surveys of Korea's image. To the question what comes to mind first when you think of Korea, as you can see in several results of survey, the strongest image, divided country, has remained unchanged. And as Simon said, maybe one day, if there is a reunification, maybe it can be really, really decisive moment for enhancing national brand. I think so. And then recently, CC conducted another survey this year to the question, what do you feel is most Korean? 37% of respondents answered Korean food, for example, those who experienced already Korea. So we can see the importance of Korean food, for example, to contribute for enhancing national brand. I think Ken Hom, he's very famous in Great Britain. He is a Chinese-American chef who recently visited Korea. He said, in the United States or in Europe, foreigners relate very often Korea to kimchi. To overcome this situation, we will have to reach the people with enjoyable and interesting contents, not a boring documentary video that makes you fall asleep. Like any other country, Korea has both positive and negative images. Positive images, I don't need to mention, you know that. And first, I just mention Korean themselves and blend of high-tech and tradition, economic development, etc. Negative images, they are only divided country in the world, North Korean nuclear program, negative past history, Korean War, for example, violent street demonstrations, etc. So Korea has to balance its strong negative and positive images. But as you all know, dealing with its past history and current political issues is a very tricky question. However, Korean culture and high-tech advanced technology are Korea's strong points. So we need to focus on positive aspects. There are many, many ways to promote the image of national brand. So I take some examples. Through indexes, for example, École des Mines, a very prestigious school in France, conducted a survey on educational background of CEOs based on Fortune's Global 500 companies. As you can see, Seoul National University ranked 5th. And another example of index, in 2007 UN survey of the top language distribution and application, Korean language ranked 9th. And as you all know, last week, a good news happened. Indian city Baobao has adopted Korean alphabet Hangul as its official writing system. This marked the first case of Korean alphabet being used by a foreign society. So I think it can be used as a good stepping stone to promote Korea. And another example of symbols, when we conducted the survey among Koreans and foreigners, the answers are a little bit different. To the question, what do you believe is the most appropriate symbol of Korea? Koreans answered 28% Hangul, our alphabet, and yin and yang, Taeguk, and foreigners yin and yang and Hangul. So CC just proposed a kind of symbol like this, for example. So what should we do to enhance national brand? We have to improve the fundamentals and we have to use effective delivery methods. But the fundamentals, for example, Korean politics, Korean economy, there are good sides, but there are also very much obstacles. And as you all know, it will take really a long time. So today I just want to concentrate on cultural aspects. Korean culture, for example, is a mixture of tradition and high technology. So we can make the best use of Hallyu, Korean wave, Korean popular culture, and we have to develop creative contents. And then I think we have to divide into two categories because opinion leaders and general public perception is very different. So for opinion leaders, I think it's very important to use two-way communication, interactive communication. When they feel something, if we can provide a thorough explanation, I think it can imprint a very long-lasting impression. And for general public, we cannot do two-way communication all the time, so one-way communication can be good. So we need to find ways for opinion leaders to experience Korea together with a thorough explanation. I think this is a very effective way to leave a lasting imprint of Korea. And comments made by opinion leaders after of experience Korea in person has a great impact on the general public, as a lot of people already mentioned in previous session. For example, now Michael Jackson passed away. He was really fascinated with the taste of bibimbap and introduced bibimbap to the world. And at the same time, bibimbap has also become more popular because of the global interest in health. So now I'd like to talk another target, which is the general public. Since the general public spends a lot of time reading the papers, watching TV, and surfing the internet, we must maximize these media and new way of communication like Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, etc. And 70% of Korean young adults are fanatics of American TV shows. And in Korea, it's very important to speak English, so they think it's a good way to learn English. And in the same way, Korean dramas are very popular in Asia. TV is an extremely effective way to influence others. And Hallyu, I think already you know what is Hallyu. So I think we can use also our strong point, popular culture, as the medium through which Korean culture can be spread to the rest of the world. And I'd like to also emphasize the foreigners living in Korea. Currently, over 1 million foreigners live in Korea, exactly 1,100,000 foreigners. So we must make Korea a country which is hospitable to foreigners. This in turn will spark investment by foreign companies, which will stimulate foreign visits, ultimately enhancing national brand. So as you can see, according to the region, the strategy has to be differentiated, not only by people, but by region. We have to adapt our methods or our strategy to promote Korea's national brand. So it's the experience. So I'd like to propose a strategy which I call crossroads. So we have to provide things to see, things to eat, things to enjoy, and things to talk about. As you can see, the first road is the things to see. Why do foreigners choose Korea among all the Asian countries? To experience that which is unique to Korea. And there is urban culture and shopping culture. I think Korea is one of the unique countries where people can shop 24 hours a day. So a lot of performances also. And second road, things to eat. Foreigners who have tried Korean food favor the globalization of Korean food. So I think we can use that. And the third road, things to enjoy. Like Spanish's Tomato Festival, Brazil's Rio Carnival. In Korea, we have also our very